What do you do when you're in a relationship with someone that you absolutely love? For some reason, there's some negative tension going on in there, and you just want to break that tension and get back into the space that you know and desire. That's what's coming up here on the Life Peaks University podcast. I'm your host, Esty Rappaport, here to help you rewire your brain to be more efficient and effective. I am super excited to introduce to you a couple who's been working with people since 2009 with their coaching company, Elliott Life Coaching, and they've been doing a whole bunch of different things, different methods. What I really like about this couple, Chuck and Ashley, who they have different ways of doing things, like not the typical language and typical things of talking, but it doesn't make it complicating. That makes it only easier for you to be able to understand. So thank you so much, Ashley and Chuck, for being here. I'm excited to be speaking with you. You want to start by telling us how you guys met?
Ashley and I met in college at Lee University.
Woo-hoo.
Yeah, Ashley was in grad school. I was an undergrad. And see, Ashley worked at the rec center, and she'd work at the front desk, and she'd also teach Pilates and some other classes and things like that. And I'd be working out or playing racquetball. And there's this girl who just always walked past and seemed like she just lingered and wanted to talk to me. So eventually,
I thought he was going to say I was like peering through the glass, because sometimes he'll tell people that. So maybe
I'll leave that part out. I don't want to embarrass you too bad. But then we started talking in college, and hit things off. And then we got married in 2007.
Oh, wow. So that is 14 years. Yeah.
14 years. I've been married for 14 years.
Yeah. So we knew we wanted to have a good relationship, and that was a priority early on in our relationship. And so we even got to be marriage educators after about a year, and there's a federal grant. We got to teach marriage workshops, and yet we also knew there was a lot of struggle. It takes a lot to have a good relationship, because there's a lot of places it can go wrong.
It's hard work.
Yeah. So we just continued to share our story and just share a real story. Like we would have a hard time with laundry and figuring that out. Like we just would talk about it. And instead of trying to act like we had all of the answers. And I think that people have related to that, because it is sometimes those simple things that really get us stuck in relationships. Mm-hmm. So a few years ago, we faced recurrent miscarriage. It was several years of the process, but we decided we really wanted to help couples. We were both working our full-time jobs, and we decided to turn our living room into a film studio and just, film a series. And so our first one was Love and Loss, and we talked about grief. And then we created a series a year later, right in the middle of the pandemic. We filmed it, and it's called Why People Leave. And we look at like why people leave relationships and unpack a theory that I developed called switch theory, where it kind of explains this cognitive process that happens where the relationship begins to break down.
So let's get into that. What is switch theory?
Okay, so switch theory, basically, if you think about your relationships, we'll take a new relationship example, maybe a new girlfriend. So two friends, they're hit it off, they're excited, they start talking, think that they have these expectations like, oh, this could be my new best friend. Well, in time, we move from this positive space where we have all of these hopes and ambitions about the relationship, and we may end up feeling frustrated or disappointed. Let's say that you text them and they don't respond, and a week later, oh, I'm sorry, I was busy. And well, then it happens again, and we find ourselves moving from this positive middle space with positive thoughts, feelings, and actions. And then we kind of move into this negative middle space where we start to have doubts about the relationship. Maybe we start to think more negatively, and maybe question, maybe they are rejecting us. Maybe I should go ahead and reject them first. And so at first the behavior, we're questioning it. And then in time, we begin to have this negative expectation about the relationship. And if we don't get back to this positive space, mentally, we'll find ourselves wanting to check out emotionally, maybe even physically, of the relationship. So whether it is just a friendship, a work relationship, or an intimate spouse relationship, it is something that we've noticed. We go through this process repeatedly of moving back and forth from this positive and negative space.
What point does it move from the positive to the negative?
Yeah, like Ashley said, we have unmet expectations often in a relationship, because any relationship you get into, you have some expectations. So Esty, if we're going to be friends with you, we might have expectations that you say things a certain way, or that you show up, or you respond to us reaching out. And then whenever that expectation isn't met, then we move a little bit more towards a negative space because we expect something, our expectations are broken. And then if we don't have a reason for it, we don't have a conversation about it, most of the time our thinking becomes a little bit more negative. And it's usually mild in the beginning because you can have an excuse. I was like, well, she was busy, and that's fine. But the more that something happens in relationships that it's an unmet expectation, the more likely we are to move into that negative mental space.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, though. Like, when does this happen? I think it can happen differently for different people. So for some, they might really quickly shut down and move to a negative space. And some might blissfully live in the positive space, sometimes almost too long where
you're like, that was an abusive relationship.
Yeah, maybe,
great point. Yeah.
Maybe that was not something to be okay with, right? So each person can be different, but even in any healthy relationship, you move to a negative space. So we don't want people thinking, that, oh, you can live in this like positive space. And
it's not utopia.
Never have anything bad happen. No, but I can be mad at Chuck and get myself back to this positive space and try to communicate frustration with him from a positive space. So if I'm in a negative space and we'll say laundry, he didn't do laundry and I'm frustrated about it. Like, you never do the laundry. You just expect me to do everything, right? That's me complaining. I'm not asking for what I want. But if I say, it's probably not personal, I'm frustrated, but I want to have a win-win. And I don't want it to be, a bigger fight. So I'm going to ask him for what I'm like, Chuck, I noticed the laundry isn't done. I'm frustrated about it. Could you tell me what happened? You agreed that you were going to do this, right? And so I'm not ignoring the issue, but I'm acknowledging I've gotten in a positive, or I've gotten from a positive space to a negative space. I want to get back to that positive space. And so I've got to have some conversation in order to move back to this positive space.
Yeah. Now I want to go deeper into that, but I first want to step a step back.
Okay.
What about the expectations part themselves? How are we making sure that both people are aware of the expectations? And how do we know that the expectations are healthy, reasonable, normal expectations?
That's a great question. See, you often have to communicate about what it is that you expect. So if you get into, let's just use a dating relationship, talking about what is it that your hopes and plans maybe are for the relationship and having boundaries. Not that you're putting too much pressure on the relationship, but you say something as soon as there's an expectation that isn't met. And I think that a lot of times, especially in dating relationships, we put a lot of pressure because we want to rush things and we want to get to know somebody and we want to feel more connected than the amount of time and connection has allowed for.
And we
haven't given it time to know those things.
And we'll want it to win so much that we want to be in a positive space, or we want it to work so much that we won't look at those things. Like people say, like, we put on blinders. And so if we're not looking, we're being blind to it, then we might miss those red flags.
I think that slowing things down. So in relationships, I don't know if you've seen this or not, but oftentimes when somebody jumps in really hot and heavy at first, it often means that they're going to leave really quickly. I've seen that multiple times in dating relationships, unfortunately, marriages, work relationships, friendships. If you'll slow things down and talk about what it is that you want from it and be honest, then that relationship is higher quality and it lasts longer. This is everything from hiring an employee. Have an extra 2 or 3 interviews. Really think about what is it that you want in this person who's going to fill the role. When you're thinking about marrying somebody, when you're thinking about dating somebody, ask the questions. I tell people the story about how when I started dating Ashley, she had a long list of questions that she wanted to know the answer to. She wanted to know, what would your home life look like? Give me some information about your background. How do you think we'd handle finances? And this is when we'd been dating for a little bit longer and we were considering marriage.
Yeah, I hope not the first date.
Not the first date. That would have been a little bit overwhelming. But I think at the appropriate time, setting yourself up for success. So not putting more pressure on the relationship that needs be at an early stage, because that can crush it. And then when it gets more serious, being upfront about your expectations. And sometimes people feel like it ruins the magic or something. And if relationships are really meant to be, everything's just going to fall into place and we're going to be this perfect match. It doesn't work that way. For jobs, for friendships, for dating, for whatever. You have to communicate about it.
Yeah. One of the problems I see with expectations is sometimes we aren't even aware of our own expectations and we don't take time to process it. I'm going to go out for a walk and then all of a sudden it's raining and I'm mad. And I'm like, well, I didn't even take time to think about whether or not I would need an umbrella. We just are in the fast-paced world and we do the same things with our own emotions. We don't take time to process what's going on. Yeah. So if I'm not aware of my expectations, I can't communicate them with him to make sure that they align and that we would even be a good fit.
And we kind of hit on this a little bit, but being self-aware in your own level of emotional intelligence, like, okay, do I understand my triggers, my wants, my needs enough to be able to communicate them? And then you're in a more healthy place to communicate your expectations instead of just getting mad with reactions when your expectations aren't met.
100%. I am such a strong believer that self-awareness is a start to anything.
Oh, it's a superpower.
Yeah. It's like, if only there's a way to say like, you do this thing and your self-awareness will go up, what this world would be like. But it just takes real work on yourself and patience with yourself and looking inside and sometimes even help from other people just to help yourself communicate and realize what's going on here for you to get better at that self-awareness. So that way you could, going back to his expectations, you know what you expect of yourself and of the other person. Because sometimes I think this is what I see in people. They get mad at the other person before it was like even ever an expectation anywhere.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And then all of a sudden we're angry and we're not quite sure why. And we don't know how to communicate that we're frustrated to the other individual because it'll feel like it's out of left field to them. It'll feel unreasonable and we feel silly and we're going to ruin the relationship. So what we do is we start moving to that negative space. That's exactly what you just said. So what you did is you played out that, and then you're moving to a negative space without communicating about it. And then all of a sudden you hang out less, you call less, you spend less time together, and that relationship ends and you might wonder why, and the other person might wonder why as well.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So let's say we're in that negative space. How do we go back out to the positive?
Well, see, sometimes we drift into this negative space, but it often takes like this manual reset to get into a positive space. You have to address the unmet expectation and you have to talk about it. So you have to either process in your own level of self-awareness to say, is this me or is this something that I need to talk about? Because we often will dwell on things, but not really do the work to think and process about what's really underneath the surface.
Yeah, if we ask ourselves that question, how did I get to a negative space? Or what am I really mad about? That's that self-awareness piece. But then we can ask ourselves, well, what have I tried? So in most relationships, we tend to feel like we get frustrated. We have two options. We can either speak about it or we stay quiet. Well, often people will first start by saying nothing, like, I'll kind of sit back and watch, like with that scenario I gave with a girlfriend, you're like, oh, they didn't text back, but if it happens again, I'll say something or I'll be frustrated. We might give a little bit of patience. We might stay in this positive space, but eventually we might either say something from a positive space, like, oh, we might kind of make a joke about it. Or you're like, oh yeah, you can ever text me back? Are we going to hang out? It might be something lighthearted. And then we end up saying, okay, so we're going to stay in a positive space there. Or they didn't respond to that joke or they didn't text us back and we move to this negative space. Then we have the same two options. Are we going to speak about it or not speak about it? So it seems like we often start by saying, I'm not going to say anything yet. A lot of people will just gravitate towards speaking. Like I always say something. Some will gravitate toward never saying anything. But most people will kind of follow these trends of, watching and perceiving for just a little bit. And this is where that's healthy. But if this negative space, not talking is where a lot of toxic behavior happens. So if I'm frustrated at work, it's the meeting after the meeting that happens, right? I'm not going to tell you how I feel in the meeting. I'm going to go to someone's office. I'm going to, oh my goodness, they're so frustrating. And then we get this validation in that relationship instead of finding that, conflict resolution within that relationship. So same thing with friendships, with marriage, we can kind of do the same thing. We'll slam doors instead of communicating, nonverbal instead of the verbal communication. And all of that kind of falls in this area. Like, I'm not going to talk about it. Why? Because I don't feel safe. Well, so we kind of get in those issues like, why am I in a negative space? How do I get back to a positive space? Well, we got to understand why we're there. How do we get there? Is this behavior working for me? Well, not speaking usually creates distance. So we're either getting closer together or farther apart in those relationships. So when we're in a negative space, if we want to get back to a positive space, we really have to look at what that negative space looks like, what's going on, what are our behaviors like, and how do we change those?
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying that we have to right away go straight in, not right away. Like, what would you suggest is my question. What would you suggest to someone instead of just like giving that space and falling back into that negative to be able to come from a positive space and break out of that negative space?
Asking for what it is that you need. Yeah. I think that we're often scared to ask for what it is that we need because we worry it's going to make a relationship worse or we're going to seem selfish. So what if we actually did that? It's like, talk to your friend and say, hey, you haven't responded the last couple of times. Is everything okay? It's like, because I feel like things aren't okay between the two of us when you don't respond. Is that normal? Or are you just busy? Saying it, actually saying it. And so if Ashley and I have a conflict and if I find myself being in a negative space and I'm just kind of dwelling on something, me tracing back and thinking about, did she say something that hurt my feelings 2 days ago that I never made a comment about? Then I need to maybe go back and say, like, hey, I don't know that you meant anything, but I just feel like there's this distance between us because I felt like you were just being critical about this.
Yeah. And we do bring some lighthearted things to it in our own relationship. And so sometimes whenever it feels like there's a little bit of tension, he'll kind of make a joke and he'll say, are we done with this terrible, horrible fight? And it's like, it wasn't a terrible, horrible fight, but it's like, are we friends? Like I'm noticing some tension, but I want to be in a positive space. And so we've asked things like, hey, can we be friends? And that's that like white flag. And you're like, hey, I want to be close to you. Is something going on? And usually that is comforting to the other person and kind of create space where we can laugh a little bit, but then talk about it. Well, I felt frustrated about this, but I'm not, he's not coming like, obviously you're ticked off, right? That would push me further away from him and more into a negative space. So we do think it's really important in couples, if you can communicate clearly how you feel or have some trigger words that are good trigger words. It's like how can we end this terrible fight, that can help you to then move toward connection instead of distance.
Yeah. Now, do you think that both people in the relationship have to be in the negative space, or it's possible for one person to be in the negative and one person in the positive?
Oh, that's a great question. We find that happens a lot.
Yeah.
Like I could be frustrated with you, Esty, and you wouldn't even know about it. And you could just be like, what? No, I feel like Chuck and I are cool. Like everything's fine right now. And I'm building up this horrible person in my head and I never talked to you about it.
Like how unfair is that to you,
That's
right?
really unfair. Yeah.
You could have told me and I could have said sorry and we could have been okay. Right. And this is what happens. Yes. Sometimes people leave out the door, the divorces, they leave like the other person's in shock. And like, well, I never told you. Right? You were in a negative space and you were faking it. How confusing is this for the person who doesn't know that you're upset?
Mm-hmm.
So our rule of thumb is if you're mad, like if I'm mad, if I have an issue, if I'm in a negative space, it's my responsibility to communicate my needs, to become aware of my needs, to communicate my needs, to ask for what I want in a healthy way. Because we see a lot of lose-lose in communication strategies. And so people will say, get in here and do the dishes, or you never do the dishes, or we do these things that really are lose-lose, right? So if I'm complaining and I say to Chuck, oh, I see you didn't do the dishes. Well, if he jumps up and goes, oh, yes, ma'am, I'm going to do the dishes, like, he feels emasculated. If he doesn't do the dishes, it's like stand up like, oh, she's a jerk.
That starts a fight.
Then that starts a fight. And so me and the way that I was in a negative space and the way I communicated from a negative space created a lose-lose. But it's his fault, right? He did the dishes and I'm innocent. And I wouldn't be so ticked off if he would actually do the dishes. And you see this when you get into marriage counseling, you get a problem and you're like, I don't know whose fault. I think it's both of y'all's fault. And like, yeah. It takes two to have a fight most of the time, right? There can be guilty parties. I'm not saying that there isn't, a more innocent person, but we often can take more responsibility for our struggles, our weaknesses, our bad communication than we tend to. So in that same situation, if you were talking a minute ago about asking for what you want, if I would just say, I've noticed the dishes in the sink, I don't say that part, but I say, hey, are you going to do the dishes still? I just talked to him. I'm trying to specifically ask a question, and that's pointing it out. Or I could even just say, hey, I feel frustrated that you said you were going to do the dishes and now I see them there. So I feel like you're just expecting me to do it. Right. Because sometimes that's been my perception, that if I see dishes there, that I think that he's expecting me to do it. And he's not. That's not the message he's sending me. He's just, oh, I'm busy, I didn't get to it. I'll still get to it. And so when we're practicing that communication and asking for what we want, we can realize my perception, had this expectation and I was moving to a negative space without him really intending to put those thoughts in my mind. So it's very complex that we work and all of our relationships. So it's amazing that we can even have good ones from time to time.
From time to time, more often than not, I think.
Yeah, hopefully, right? Mostly good relationships overall.
Yeah, I see you had a really good diagram. You want to share it with us? I think it will make it much clearer for us to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we have this positive and negative space. Like we said, in the beginning of a relationship, we tend to start off in this positive space. And whenever we have these unmet expectations, we tend to even stay in that positive space at first. So if you have a coworker that is late for work, the first time they're late, it's an unmet expectation. You didn't expect them to be late, but you're concerned. You think, oh, I hope they didn't have a car accident or something. You're positive. You might even speak about, oh, is everything okay? But then you end up, eventually, if it's habitual, the person's late over and over again, you find yourself having this unmet expectation. Now they're dumping assignments on you, or that you're having to pick up their slack, and you move to this negative space. Well, if you notice in both images, right, we've got this positive space on one side, the negative space on the other, and then you have all of your thoughts, right? You either have positive thoughts in a positive space or negative thoughts in a negative space. So it's not surprising that our thoughts come before our behavior, but if we have positive thoughts, we're going to tend to have more positive behavior. And if we have negative thoughts, we're going to have more negative behavior. So we have a couple hours of workshops that we could do that really stem just from this, but just in summarizing it, there's so much negative behavior. I think we spend a lot of time with the negative thoughts, but choosing not to speak. So this is where we go and we triangulate, or we go talk to other people and we complain about them. We try to get them on our side, or we slam doors. We're sarcastic. We talk to the person across the room without really talking to them. We do a lot of different, nonverbal communication that can make it difficult. So the commonality that we see is that we all want to be in a positive space, but we just don't know how to get there. So I think this graphic helps us understand really what's going on so that we can move back to a positive space.
Yes. Now, do you have any tips on how to, if you're in the negative space and you want to get into the positive space, right? There's something that you're mad about, but you don't want to make the other person mad or feel guilty. Like, I find that quite a bit of a pattern. People are like, but I'm going to hurt them if I say that. But
yeah. Okay. So one question I would start with, is, have you paid attention to the distance in the relationship and your silence? Has your silence helped? Because sometimes people think, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to hurt their feelings, but we create a little distance. We create a little distance because we're protecting ourselves, because we don't feel safe. If we don't feel safe, then we can't share. And so if kind of doing the self-awareness processing, am I in a positive space? Oh, I'm moving to a negative space. And if they don't know it, they can't do anything to fix it. And so helping them to kind of really see that will hopefully help motivate them to communicate, and helping them to see, the reasons it didn't work in the past can help them to say, maybe there is hope for the future. Because even like in addiction and marriages and all these different struggles we see people oftentimes will try it once. They'll try to talk about it once. And if it doesn't work, they don't ever want to talk about it again.
Yeah, they drop it. And that happens so often. And a lot of it is how you frame it. So if you know that if you know that you have an issue with somebody, but you don't want to bring it up because you're worried it's going to make them feel bad, man, it's how you frame it. It's how you talk about it. If you know something's wrong, you want to have a good relationship. If I was going to talk to somebody, it's like, I want to have a really good relationship with you, and I don't want anything to be between us. So I've just been kind of thinking about this. So I just want to process it and get it out on the table.
Yeah. Most
of the time, that will improve the relationship. Now, are there some times where somebody will react poorly and it could make things worse? Possibly. But that says more about that other person than it does about you. Okay? So don't let somebody else's character and their communication skills dictate your character and your communication skills. You can still be above average, better than average, and healthy, even when somebody handles themselves in an inappropriate way.
Yeah, that was very, very well said. I think that the way you frame it and the way you say it will make a whole massive difference. And we can't let their unhealthiness stop you from being your best you. Now, you mentioned, Ashley, multiple times actually, that sometimes we don't say something because we don't feel safe. Now, usually it's from trust and things that happen over time. And it's like this space that has to be created between two people. But do you have any suggestions on how we could make this space a little more safe so it's a little bit easier to talk?
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing I would do is have the person go through the exercise of thinking about like why I don't feel safe, right? Are there things that we can ask for? So if I say to Chuck, like, I don't feel safe because every time I share my feelings, I feel like you walk out of the room or just something. Chuck doesn't do those things. But if I am naming them specifically, all apart from talking to him first, but I'm like, okay, these are the things that happen. If I were to talk, maybe I could ask for him not to do those two things, right? Like, so I have understood what I need to feel safe and then what to ask for. So that would be one route. But I also think if we would take the time to be aware, what hasn't worked in the past, what makes me feel unsafe, and then is there anything that it really isn't his fault, that would be something that I can say, ooh, I want to stop ascribing that to Chuck. Because the example I gave with dishes came a little bit more from my family of origin and the way that things work, because my dad worked outside the home, my mom did not. And so it felt like that it was always the woman's role. And one of my questions on my little pre-marriage survey, right, was he going to check the boxes, was that I had a passion to work and I had a passion to not have all those responsibilities also on me. So that was a question like, are you going to expect me to do everything? And so I was trying to work through my expectations, right? This was long before this framework was developed in our minds. But as I understood, hey, this was maybe an issue for me, I wanted to ask these questions. Well, if I notice it's an issue for me, I've got to try to say, is this what Chuck's doing? Or is this my own trigger for my own childhood? So going through that process to say, is the issue really with Chuck? Or is it just that I don't feel safe? Because a lot of times we don't feel safe in relationships apart from the actual relationship. So I might not feel safe with him because of someone else who broke my trust.
I think something also is this is not just harm reduction. So you should be investing in your relationship. You should be investing in building this house, this castle in the positive space.
Yeah.
You should be investing in the relationship, that you spend quality time, that you do the type of things that build trust and communication that make you feel connected to the other person. So if it's in a job, it's team building activities, it's spending quality time together, maybe outside of the regular work hours, having communication about other parts of your life. If it's a relationship, if it's a marriage, you go on dates together, you do activities, you have hobbies together, you do things other than just managing and then hoping that you can fix it when it goes below the average line. Let's try to have above average relationships. And then when you have a little tiff, I can look at you and be like, no, I love you. You love me. We're good. This just thing over here is an outside issue that we're going to talk about it. We're going to squash it and we're going to keep going.
Yeah. If your marriage is a car and it's always on empty, you're going to probably talk about hating your car a lot. It keeps running out of gas. Right?
It keeps dying, but it's because you're out of gas.
Yeah. If you hate your marriage and you're not putting any gas into it, then it can be hard.
So I think getting underneath it, this is a combination of something that Ashley said there. I've worked with couples for a while, and there's a couple I worked with, 6 months to a year ago. And one of the people in the relationship wasn't feeling safe, kind of like what you were talking about. And we broke down what it was. And it was because I feel like whenever we get into a conflict, this person said that I feel like when you walk out of the room, it means that you're going to leave me, because they had a previous partner leave them and drive off and just leave and end the marriage. And that's how their past relationship ended.
Trigger.
It was a trigger. And we had to have a conversation. It was like, why are you leaving when you do that? And the partner that was leaving told me, I just need a second to breathe, because I want to talk to you the way that I need to talk to you, and something that I'm proud of. And I want to make it a win-win. So instead of walking outside, we just said, okay, can you go into the other room for 7 minutes, 10 minutes, take a breather, do whatever else, listen to a couple songs, listen to some music or something for a minute, and then come back. So feeling unsafe, it was because whenever there was any type of conflict, they felt like it meant the relationship was over. And that's not what it meant. But because of past triggers, you felt like the relationship was going to be over. So a safe space can be a combination of understanding yourself, your own expectations, communicating that with the other person, helping them to set up the environment. And then also you're going to feel safer when you make positive investments in the relationship.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. Going back to all that is the self-awareness part of like understanding they're not leaving and why they feeling like this is simply because of previous things. And at the same time, I'm taking a breather. Like I'm not leaving the relationship. I need to leave this conversation for a little bit. So all falls back into there. Yeah. I love the example of the car. We can't have our energy level like go down to empty because then we're always trying to like refill and trying to go up. And it's just not working.
It's exhausting.
And I'm curious, how did this switch theory affect your own marriage?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Not only our own marriage, but our whole house. We have 3 boys. We use this all the time. So we are thankful for it and just the ideas and how it's come together. So it's come from years of research and teaching. And I would whiteboard with students in my office who were struggling with relationships. And we would talk with people at our church and in our home, our families. And, man, it's like there's this switch. There's this space. It's like we go from where like, this is Chuck, who I love. I mean, he could say something and all of a sudden I'm like, I don't like you. And like, it's like a switch goes off. And so we're just trying to put terminology to like, yeah, I mean, all the bad things about him, they're almost stored in this part of our brain. I haven't done brain research yet, but I'm going to find some friends who are doing brain research and we'll probably get there. But I really do think if you start thinking about the negative spaces, I really feel like it's this almost compartment in our brain where we store all of the negative thoughts about our spouse. And then we have the positive and other relationships as well. And so, I mean, with one of our kiddos, with all of our kiddos, let me start again. With 2 of our kiddos who can write, we have a 3-year-old who could not do this exercise yet, but we had them like draw out the positive space, the negative space, and put it in their room so that they could think about it when they were needing to give themselves a timeout or if we gave them a timeout. Because the things that they would say, like, you guys don't love me, things like that. And so we had them write down, like, when we're in a negative space, we feel like no one loves us. And so then they're able to go in their room and think, maybe I'm in a negative space. Maybe this will pass whenever I start to feel better. What if I could do some things to help it pass quicker? What if there's some things I could do to get back to a positive space? Yeah. And so we also wrote down the things that they knew to be true in the positive space. And
that was helpful.
We've just done simple exercises like this. And I mean, this week I was frustrated about some conversations that we had about money. I mean, I've never known any couples to argue about money or anything, but we were having a little conversation and I went to the other room and I was like, I have to be able to get myself back to a positive space if I'm teaching other people to get back to a positive space, right? But it's work. So just because we're talking about it or I've developed this theory doesn't mean that it's just magic and it becomes easy, right? No. It's a mental process that we have to fight. We have to fight to be positive. We have to fight to reframe, to make things look better, because looking at the junk is pretty easy. Being frustrated and overwhelmed comes a lot more easily than working to think positively a lot of the time.
If nothing else, in our relationship and our marriage, I have been better since we've been doing this at recognizing when I need to talk about something, because it can be easy for me to just blow it off and be like, well, she didn't really mean anything by it. But then if I find myself dwelling on something that upset me for 12 hours, or I'm still thinking about it the next day, I'm getting better at go ahead and just say something about it, because I know it doesn't benefit me. It doesn't benefit her. It doesn't benefit my parenting, my leadership, anything if I let it dwell.
Yeah.
So I think if anything, I've gotten quicker at addressing those little things that I often would try to blow off, but I know that those little things were creating distance between us.
Yeah. Okay. Can I share a story? Do we have enough time for a story?
Yes, you do. I just feel like compelled to say something right now, that just giving the names of like the negative space and the positive space really labels it like for the brain. So it makes it easier for you to understand, like, even if you knew about this and you were self-aware about it on some level, now it's like super clear and like so easy that even kids could understand it. Like, I'm in a negative space now and I can switch out of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, what's your story?
Okay. So, and Chuck and I have told this story publicly several times. Also, I already have his permission to share, but when we were dating, one of the things that happened right before our wedding was that I found pornography on his computer, and that broke my trust. And it was really hard for us. And so this was something like, oh my goodness, I don't know. I was very much in a negative space. Again, didn't have the terminology there. But whenever he doesn't tell me how he feels, if I'm feeling like I have to like read and guess, and like, I think he might be frustrated, but he's not telling me, it really breaks down trust. And so he was saying just a second ago how he is trying to just be more brave at just telling me, like, I feel a little frustrated.
Yeah, to get current.
It actually builds my trust, because if we take that example where Chuck asked you earlier, like, hey, if he didn't tell you that he was frustrated, right, there's distance that happens because he's frustrated, so he's not going to lean in. And then you're sitting on the other side going, I guess he didn't like me. Just this weird dynamic that just creates distance. And that can happen in our marriages as well, because, hey, I'm not talking about her. He's not talking. He's like, I don't want to hurt her feelings. I'm not sure if it's a big issue. Yeah. And meanwhile, like, we're kind of drifting because I can see that something's up and he's not telling me. And therefore, is he lying? Is he cheating? Is he looking at pornography? Like, and I was like, right. All of the issues.
When you feel like you don't know, it builds distrust.
Yeah. And so for us, even talking about issues that are really hard and sensitive, that has actually brought us closer. And so I think the things that we fear will create the most distance in a relationship are sometimes the very thing that we have to look at in order to be close.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those conversations are really hard, but personally, I find them addicting. Like, they're super hard to get started, but once you're in them, they're super interesting to, like, things just fall into place. You understand each other, you feel understood, and it just makes so much more sense. Okay. So now, before we get to our final question, where could we connect with you and learn more about you?
Yeah. We're Chuck and Ashley on most all social platforms, on Instagram, Chuck and Ashley Coaching, YouTube, Chuck and Ashley. Our website is elliotlifecoaching.com, and you can find links to all kinds of things there for resources, online courses, programs, having us come in and speak, and all kinds of things.
Awesome. Okay. Final question. How would you describe an extraordinary relationship without using love, trust, and communication and self-awareness? Let's make that 4 words.
Oh, wow.
Okay. I think you have to learn, laugh, and do those. We'll just say those are 2 of the things, that 2 of the 4 we taught a talk on it, and we were saying these are all the things you need to do: research-based, evidence-based activities. So
learn together. Learn something together. That could be you have a hobby, you do something that's like that, and laugh, have fun together.
Oh yeah. And when you're in that space, you're in that positive space with that laughing, and you're just forever learning. You're just going to make sure you're headed up and you're just going in a good direction. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ashley and Chuck. This was fun, really informative, and you guys explained things in a really clear way. So thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
That's all for this episode of the Life Fix University podcast, but I have a huge favor to ask of you that will not only support the show, but will also help the people you love most. We are striving for 1 million downloads by the end of 2025, and we can't do this without your help. If you love this episode, please share it with 2 of your family and friends so they too can rewire their brains to have an extraordinary marriage. It was awesome spending time with you, and I'll see you on the next episode.